welcome everyone to the first meeting of the Sturbridge Historical Society for this year, 2025. I must say, I'm speechless. Good. Thank you all for coming out. It's great to see this crowd, and you will be well rewarded with this program tonight. It's going to be pretty good. As usual, always, we'd like to thank the Public House. They go above and beyond as our host to provide the chairs, some light refreshments, and the space. And it's truly appreciated, and we thank them every time we meet. Yep. Poor lady's made about 5 trips with coffee. She said, they never drink this much coffee. Keep it up. I would like to, on a more serious note, it was brought to my attention, a gentleman from West Brookfield recently passed away. He was very active in their local history. And if we could just take 5-10 seconds to pay our respects to Bill Jansen, who passed away in West Brookfield. Jenkins. Sorry, Bill Jenkins.
Thank you.
Thank you. The Historical Society is looking to activate our board of directors. We have been incorporated for many years, and that incorporation included at one time board of directors and officers, annual meetings, elections, and we've kind of got laxed on that, and it's almost non-existent. So we'd like to bring that back. So we are looking to establish 12 directors to be part of the Historical Society, and we'll meet perhaps 4 times a year, and just general overviews, programs, what we like to do, where we want to go. Instead of just having 1 or 2 people making those decisions, we've got a small core of people who have been meeting over the last year that have been great for getting the programs going. But to be official, we'd like to get some directors. So if you have any interest, either see Sandy in the back on your way out or contact us by email. No big deal, no obligation, but it'd be nice to have a formal board of directors. Upcoming programs for 2025. Thursday, February 27th, our own Rich Paradis will present a program on covered bridges of Massachusetts. He's explored the technology and the history of the covered bridges found throughout our state. Thursday, March 27th, Bill Reed will present a program, Notable and Notorious, Curious and Infamous Characters from the Last Green Valley. So our Chief Ranger, Bill Reed, from the Last Green Valley, shares some of his stories of many interesting and important people, as well as colorful characters who have lived in this region. Thursday, April 24th, I myself will be presenting America 250, The Revolution Comes to Sturbridge. This is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, 1775. So we're going to have a program devoted to that in April. And I believe the town is going to be having some events and activities throughout the year. Thursday, May 22nd, our own Wally Kersey will present the Sturbridge Bicentennial. In 1938, Sturbridge celebrated the 200th anniversary of the founding of the town. The celebration included a highly choreographed pageant representing the history of the community. Mr. Hersey will discuss these celebrations and present a restored version of a film taken at that time. And that's pretty interesting. Just in terms of what you see in the background for the immediate area of the town common. And as I mentioned earlier, the town's plans to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of America. So that our town administrator establishing a committee to look into, make several subcommittees for planning events leading up to this celebration. So if you are interested or know someone who's interested in planning with the town, contact Robin Grimm, the Sturbridge Town Administrator. Just go to the town website and you'll see her, but they're looking for interested parties. Tonight, we're going to cancel tonight's program. We're not going to. Our own Robert Arnold from Sturbridge, we're presenting a story. It's called Road Trip 1927, 18,000 miles in a Model T Ford. As Bob will say, his grandparents decided to take this trip. Besides being an incredibly interested and curious person, he was also a very good photographer. So Bob has been going through about 10 million pictures to weed it down to what you're going to see tonight. So without further ado, may I introduce Bob Arnold from Sturbridge.
Thank you, Doug. And thank you all for coming out on a cold winter evening. It was this kind of weather during the winter of 1927 that my grandparents left on their epic road trip. And they made a notation that they got to East Brookfield and they stopped to take the chains off as the road conditions got better. I can't imagine driving from Worcester to East Brookfield with chains on and a Model T anyway, but considering that it was day one of an 8-month journey, it's pretty remarkable. My grandfather was, I think, 49. Yep. My grandfather, Kerry Melville, or Giggy as we called him, was a professor of mathematics at Clark University. And he had taught there for 20-odd years. And so when 1927 came up, he had the opportunity to take a sabbatical year. And he and my grandmother, Maud, or Gaga as we called her, thought that it would be great to take a trip like this. It would be an adventure, and it would also be a real educational opportunity for the kids. And they had 3 children. Maud Jr., my mother, who was 16, Martha, who was 10, and Bob, who was 14. Now, it just makes me shudder to think about being in a car for 8 months with 3 teenagers, but so be it. That's a statement about my grandparents. They were wonderful people. They had very wide-ranging interests. They were interested in history, in music, in fine arts, in crafts, in the natural sciences. And Gaga was also a communicator. She was a letter writer. If she had had the internet when she was alive, she would have broken it. Absolutely, writing to people. And she recorded details of the trip in her daily journals and encouraged the children to do the same. That lasted about a couple of months, and then the kids decided it really wasn't worth it. My grandfather was a very, very accomplished amateur photographer, and he shot photos throughout the whole trip and ended up with almost 1,000 of his negatives from the trip. The combination of those photos and the journal entries gives a very, very detailed description of what this family endured, in many cases, on this trip. Both the good and the bad. And just going through and picking some of the highlights from the trip, the photographic highlights particularly, it's hard to cut. It's hard to know what to cut. So if it seems like I'm rushing through some of these, I really am, because I want to show you as many photographs as possible. Now the Melvilles, this is some of the journals that they did. This is Hubbub. This is what took them 18,000 miles around the United States. Can you guys see okay? Am I in your way? Okay. The Melvilles purchased a Model T touring car for the trip and had it set up with a Ruxtell axle, so they could pull a trailer. And the trailer would carry their tending, their camping materials, their clothing, their tools, their food, and anything else they had to put in the trailer. Because you're talking now 5 people in the car. They planned, this was the route. They planned on leaving in January, going all the way down to Miami, then going back up across the Gulf Coast to Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to California, then north to Washington, and back to New England through the northern tier of states, hopefully in time for the kids to get back into school at a reasonable time. And they actually held pretty well to their schedule. They left on January 29th and returned on September 17th. Almost 8 months on the road with a total mileage of 17,671 miles. Now, recognizing the challenges that the Melvilles were going to meet, many of their friends and neighbors, let me catch up to myself here. Many of their friends and neighbors donated items for the trip. Flashlight, inner tubes, a motometer, camp stove, and even some cash. And despite all the planning that the Melvilles did, some of their friends were afraid that they really might not ever return, because after all, they were venturing out into the land of rattlesnakes and highwaymen. Now, no matter the degree of planning, there are always things that you have no control over, like the weather. And that was evident on day 1. They had planned on leaving on Friday, January 28th, but it snowed, of course. And so they waited until Saturday afternoon, January 29th. The weather was, as Gaga described, sunny and spring-like. And as the road conditions improved, as I said before, they stopped in East Brookfield to take the chains off. Now keep in mind that this is in a car with no side windows, just flaps that could be brought down when it rained heavily. Now at this point in the trip, there was only 5 of them in the car. The trailer and the camping gear had been shipped to Gigi's brother in North Carolina. So the Melvilles were staying in boarding houses or with friends. Despite the wintry beginning, the first few days of the trip were fairly easy, driving through Meriden and Bridgeport, Connecticut, down to Elizabeth, New Jersey, where, at mileage 164, Gaga noted in her notebook, rather ironically, quote, sort of homesick. A few days to go. Now, when they reached Washington, it was the first time that they paused to do some sightseeing. Gaga noted the reckless driving in D.C. a number of times, and that they got lost in a regular maze. But they did manage to see most of the important sites. The Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, which they climbed, all 555 feet, 898 steps, according to Gaga. And Bob especially wanted to see the mast of the Maine Memorial. By February 9th, our travelers were in North Carolina, where they stayed with Gigi's brother and uncrated and set up the trailer. After staying about a week, the Melvilles were back on the road and made a visit to Mr. Kennedy's pottery, an early example of a regional tradition still carried on today. On February 21, Gaga wrote, "South Carolina is the most desolate and lonesome country, and only 1/2 fair roads." And those roads had already taken their toll on the trailer hitch, so Gigi had to take Hub up to a garage to get stiffer springs for the rest of the trip. A little further south, in Georgia, Gaga noted, quote, "About 18 miles from Darien, Georgia, we ran down to, get this, a 1/2 pint of gasoline. And we were told of a station just ahead. just reached it. The gas station was a very picturesque place, Spanish moss and great oaks everywhere. And having gotten fuel, they looked next for accommodations, and they reached the Palmetto camp and hired a cottage for $2 a night. Total 2,010 miles. Well, 110 miles, sorry. The Palmetto camp was quite the facility for the early auto tourist, featuring electric lights, hot and cold water, public bake oven, and even a cement wash pit. Now, given the number of photographs that Gigi took at Palmetto, he was obviously intrigued by the variety of state-of-the-art campers. Now, crossing the state line into Florida, the Melvilles hurried through Jacksonville. Gaga thought it looked dirty. Instead, headed for St. Augustine, where they did their first tent up. That meant unpacking the trailer, setting up the tent, the camp kitchen, a procedure they would go through for a total of 83 more times on this trip. They stayed for a number of days here, visiting many of the historic sites in the oldest city in the US, including the oldest house, the city gate, Fort San Marcos. This is amazing. On a side trip to an alligator farm, Bob wrote in his journal, the farm has 600 or so alligators and ostriches too. I let one bite my finger, and we saw our first pelican. I don't know whether it was the ostrich or the alligator. Now, by mid-March, our travelers had arrived in Miami and were very impressed with the opulent hotels which lined much of the waterfront. And of course, even though it's late winter, if you're in Miami Beach, you got to take a dip in the ocean and maybe have a picnic on the beach. Now, just a quick sidebar here. Gigi processed a lot of his films on the road, in the back seat, at night, in the back seat of the Model T, excuse me. And he had very little control over the temperature of the processing chemicals, which resulted in damage to a lot of them, to some of them, not a lot. In this case, this is what's called reticulated grain, and it's a result of the developer being too hot. It's just something that, unfortunately, a number of his negatives were severely damaged because of that. Now, given Gigi's interest in geography, I'm not surprised that he wanted to go all the way to Cape Sable, which is the southernmost point of the contiguous United States. In 1927, that area was accessible only by a poorly unmaintained sand road, which ran through portions of what is now Everglades National Park. Gaga noted that, quote, the last 7 miles were terrible roads, holes 18 to 24 inches deep, made 7 miles in 1.5 hours. The road was so rough that Bob drew a drawing of it in his journal. And this may seem like an exaggeration, but Gigi's photograph confirms just exactly what that road was like. Hardly suited for a Model T. But despite the travel difficulties, they did make it to Cape Sable and found that the few houses there were built on 6-foot stilts, so floodwaters would run underneath with little damage. A situation we see on our coastal properties now. Heading back up the west coast of Florida, the Melvilles encountered some really good roads, and Gaga actually drove for the first time, although I don't think she ever had a driver's license. By March 22nd, they were in Tarpon Springs, and being familiar with the fishing industry on Cape Cod, the sponge boats at the waterfront drew their attention. And Gaga noted that, quote, "It's like being in a foreign country with Greeks everywhere and beautiful sponges and corals." Further north in the Big Bend area of Florida, they did a tent up in Madison in the back of a Standard Oil filling station, 1 block from the city center. You can just make them out back there. There's the tent and there's hubbub right back there. Gaga described Madison as, quote, "a beautiful city with flowers and blooming trees everywhere." But she also noted that the county was on edge because the sheriff got drunk and shot a man. He claimed it was an accident, that his gun went off way too easy. Gaga wrote, quote, "Everyone carries a gun, surely a fierce country." Road conditions have been quite varied so far on the trip. That's an understatement. But nearer to the Florida coast in Scanlon, the Melvilles were presented with something new and quickly learned of the challenges of driving in a cypress swamp. Perhaps these conditions were the reason that the general merchandise not only sold gasoline and oil, but also caskets. The rest of the trip along the Florida Panhandle was relatively easy with good roads and good weather. After leaving Pensacola, taking the ferry across Mobile Bay and driving to Pascagoula, Gaga noted a sign. Now you figure this out. "We'll nurse your baby and crank your Ford, but we won't cash your check." 4,481 miles. April 31 found the Melvilles in New Orleans, boarding the steamer, the capital of St. Louis, for a tour of the waterfront at a cost of $1.50 per adult. And Gaga carefully noted interesting tidbits, presumably provided by the guide on the boat. Quote, "New Orleans has 250 miles of waterfront. We passed an old gunboat that will be preserved, the Marietta. Luggers are little vessels that ply up and down the bayous carrying oysters, shrimp, crabs. And in the evening, you can buy ripe bananas, 10 cents for 40. Total 4,675 miles. In contrast to the waterfront of New Orleans, the month of May found the Melvilles entering the wide open spaces of Texas, where they could camp pretty much anywhere by the side of the road. But the wide open spaces also meant that they had to do their own side of the road repairs as well. They followed the roads down the coast to McAllen, and the city was bustling with a Lions of Texas convention. Loaded with cars, loaded. Now, the road to Rock Springs was pretty rough, as Gaga detailed what they encountered. Quote, 3 roadrunners, 13 jackrabbits, 20 dips, 7 gates, 5 mud holes, 13 fords, and 3 bumper gates. When they got to Rock Springs, they found that the town had suffered a direct hit from a series of tornadoes on April 12th. When the Melvilles arrived in the area a month after, they were stunned to see the destruction despite the work that had been done, the cleanup effort. Gaga learned some details from a resident, and she wrote, quote, "Got to Rock Springs about 7:30. A terrible wreck and most discouraging place I ever saw. 60 killed, 40 died later. Hailstones as big as a head. 3 twisters total." When the Melvilles left Rock Springs, Gaga noted that driving back up to the Terlingua area with no road signs meant a lot of wrong turns in 110-degree heat. And the only traffic they would see was the occasional mule team, which had to travel 83 miles to bring supplies to the town. Now, travel through Texas was difficult due to the extreme heat and strong winds, and obviously the lack of roads in some places. The roads were terrible to non-existent, except around the population centers. Hubbub had developed a radiator leak and would boil over every half hour. But despite the travel difficulties, the Melvilles managed to explore a good part of the state, including the San Antonio area, where they visited the Alamo and other missions. They went on to find Judge Roy Bean's Law west of the Pecos wooden courthouse in Ozona, Texas, and even visited an armadillo farm near Alpine, Texas. Now, crossing over into New Mexico, the Carlsbad Caverns afforded a break from the above-ground heat, and the kids had a great time roaming around the dunes at White Sands. Heading north, the Melvilles spent a few days in Santa Fe, which everyone enjoyed. The architecture, the art museum, the governor's palace, and all the fine shops. Stopping there was a really big hit for them all. In addition, all the surrounding pueblos provided a look into the Native American way of life and the long history of the area. After some shopping for supplies, doing a big washing, according to Gaga, and taking care of some repairs to Hubbub, the Melvilles set out to explore the countryside. Gaga wrote, June 7th, 1927. Left at 2 for Sky Village and the volcano cones. Never saw such wonders. Got to an arroyo we couldn't cross, about 5, and decided to camp all night. All we had for provisions was 2 boxes of crackers, a quarter-pound of cheese, and 5 small oranges. We found lots of petrified wood. We watched the sun go down behind a tall mesa, and the shadows grow long. Dark fell about 8, and we began to hear the night noises. We sat by the campfire and wrote our diaries. No one in the world knows where we are. Sounds pretty idyllic, doesn't it? But the next morning, Gaga filled in a few of the details. She starts the next day's notes with this. Wednesday, June 8th, Sky Village. Didn't sleep much. Carrie and I were on the ground, near the fire. Maud on the running board in the bundle carrier. Bob and Martha on the seats in the car. Cold. Kept the fire all night. And up at 4 to watch the day dawn. The next few days were a sightseeing dream. Albuquerque, Laguna, Acoma, the ice caves, and El Morro National Monument, where they actually got to spend some time with E.Z. Vogt, the first superintendent of El Morro. June 19 and 20 was spent near Winslow, Arizona, making some repairs to Hubbub, shipping packages back home and exploring Canyon Diablo. It's interesting to note that the post office wouldn't ship their package of declared petrified wood. The reason they gave was for fear of commercializing it. But they also suggested carrying it on a little further, shipping it, but simply declaring it as rock specimens. Odd. Excuse me. June 21, 1927 was the beginning of one of the most important weeks of the entire trip, a week spent among the Hopi. There developed a special connection between the Melvilles and these gentle, kind people, which resulted in many decades. Okay, we're back. which resulted in many decades-long relationships between the Melvilles and their newfound friends. The Hopi opened their doors to our travelers and shared much of their culture with them. The Hopi village of Walpi here on First Mesa was founded well over 1,000 years ago and has been continuously occupied since then. And the tradition of making finely decorated pottery continues to this day. With her interest in crafts, Gaga bought many pieces of pottery, baskets, and other objects with special emphasis on pieces made by artists she met in person. That connection was very meaningful to Gaga, and these Hopi pieces formed the basis of a collection of Native American arts and crafts known as the Melville Collection, now held at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. Of course, the other real benefit of staying a week at Hopi was freeing the kids from the back seat of the car so they could swim in the arroyo, go horseback riding, make new friends, and just be kids. In a letter dated June 24th, 1927, Gaga wrote to her family, and I quote, "Never in my life have I been in a place like Palaca. The thrills we have every day can't be put in a letter. I know every day makes us late, but how can we leave when such a rare opportunity is ours? Miss Ryan says they think we are real people, not just painted tourists. We are the most fortunate people on earth." Now, another quick sidebar. Excuse me. This last summer, my wife Susan and I were invited to go travel down to Arizona and make a presentation to members of the Hopi Nation about this trip and about how the Melville Collection came to be. It was remarkable to visit the village of Walpi and Tiwa and walk those same stones that my grandparents had walked 100 years ago, essentially, and to meet many of the tribal members whose parents, grandparents, great-grandparents actually made many of the objects that are in the Melville Collection. It was a remarkable trip. It really was. All right, back to 1927. Excuse me, I got to take a drink here. By midsummer, the beginning of the rainy season was imminent. And the Melvilles were told that if they were at all thinking of leaving, that they might want to consider going now, because many of the arroyo crossings and the roads would become impassable as soon as the rain started. Reluctantly, they decided to get on the road. And according to Gaga, in her journal, when they left, they drove 22.5 miles, and they came to an arroyo that was so full they couldn't cross. So they had to turn around, backtrack 5 miles to a point where they found a little bit of elevated land, and they could camp overnight and start the trip the next day. Heading towards the Grand Canyon, on July 2, at the Little Colorado Trading Post in Cameron, which is still open today, they were advised that Fords can't do it. There's a large government warning sign on there. Do not try this unless you have a Ruxtail axle and good brakes. And Gaga noted that a ranger about 15 miles up, who was, she noted, driving a Buick, got out and asked us, "Has that Ford got a Ruxtail axle?" "Yes." "Well, I guess doubtfully you'll make it. But you may have to get out and push." And Gaga noted, "Yes, we did, several times. And then we had to finally unload half the trailer and push hard for a quarter mile up, where we found a camping place." As it does with most visitors, the Grand Canyon made quite an impression on the Melvilles. And they spent the next few days exploring the overlooks all along the south rim. On July 6th, though, they decided to hike all the way down into the canyon, despite grave warnings against doing it. Even the people who ran the campground advised them against it. But they wanted to do it, so off they went. The temperature was 114 in the canyon, and the descent was very hard on Gaga, whose feet and knees hurt with every step. And it took all day until 6:30 before, as she put it, she could bathe her feet in the cool Bright Angel Creek. On the next morning, after a warm night in the canyon, our hikers left the bottom of the canyon at 5 a.m. and were making good time. But Maud Jr. was sick from drinking too much Bright Angel Creek water when she was too hot. About halfway up, a ranger offered her his mule, and the mule also carried their heavy packs all the way out. Everyone made it out by 4:15, but they were obviously very tired. After a few days' rest from the Grand Canyon, the Melvilles resumed their search for, quote, out-of-the-way places. Exactly. And just about 10 miles outside of the next town, which was Williams, just as a point of reference here, the speedometer turned 10,000 miles, okay? About sunset, they drove to what Gaga termed as a wee bird, drake. And she describes it as the most out-of-the-way place they ever saw. About 9, we got to a tiny place called Paulden. And this is really interesting. With curses and impudence from the children, we made camp. Now, just outside of Phoenix, they saw their first giant cactus. And after going through Gila, they arrived at Yuma, where Gaga noted that they were stopped for 30 minutes and they had to pull everything out, open all the suitcases, empty the trailer and everything for an agricultural inspection at the California border, California line. But, she said, we're in California at last. Now, after a hard climb up El Cajon, where they had to stop every mile or so to let Hubbub cool down, the Melvilles arrived at San Diego about 9 p.m., but it took them another hour to find Caldwell's camp on Taylor Street. They took a cabin for $1.25, and it was very luxurious. 2 rooms, electric lights, toilet, shower, and a white sink. The 15th and 16th were spent exploring the San Diego area, the museums, Point Loma, a band concert at the Navy headquarters, and a swim at Mission Beach, where they found a giant piece of kelp. At Balboa Park, the kids rode the miniature train, and they even had a chance to see Matt Gray dive from a 100-foot tower into 3 feet of water. We don't have any photographs of that, unfortunately. I would like to have seen that. Now, the plan for the next day was to drive to Tijuana via Coronado. Gaga wrote that, quote, Silver Strand Road was a lovely drive, but you never saw such a place as Tijuana. Nothing but booze and gambling everywhere you turn, and most all the people looked tough. Pretty obvious her Midwestern Methodist upbringing was showing. Total 10,720 miles. This next photo is a shocker. Heading north through Corona del Mar into Huntington Beach was a real eye-opener for the Melvilles. There were oil wells everywhere, everywhere. On the shore, in the water, even on Ocean Ave, it was a forest. Now, oil wells had been in evidence all along the Gulf Coast, but never in the numbers they saw here in California. We don't have a lot of photographs of the next stretch of time here, but continuing north, they put Catalina Island, Hollywood, Pasadena, Mount Wilson Observatory, and even Fresno in the rearview mirror. The Melvilles made a beeline for Yosemite, and they arrived at Fish Camp in the park on July 26th. This is just a remarkable photograph. The scale is just astounding. Gaga noted, at Fish Camp, up at 7, the camp cottages are decked with huge sugar pine cones. Very cool here and quiet. A fine class of tourists also. The next morning, one of the first things to do was go to Mirror Lake, of course, for an early morning photo. Then, what's next? The Wawona drive-through tree, which I didn't realize. It was 2,000 years old when they cut through it in 1881. And then, of course, the view of Yosemite Valley and Glacier Point. But the kicker here in Yosemite, love this, is a startling photo of Gaga feeding a cinnamon bun to a bear. Now, there's more about bears to come also. After a quick visit to San Francisco and Berkeley, where Gigi photographed one of the new Southern Pacific ferries, the Fresno, plying the Golden Gate, because there was no bridge. The construction on the Golden Gate Bridge wouldn't begin for another 6 years, in 1933. The Melvilles continued heading north from Sacramento and Redding through the Siskiyou Mountains into Oregon. And along the way, Gigi captured a neat photo of snow-covered Mount McLaughlin. And by August 7th, they'd reached Crater Lake, where the kids had a chance to play in a giant snow patch. Again, a chance to let them get out of the back seat of the car. The Melvilles enjoyed the small towns and wide open views of the farmlands on the drive through the fertile valleys of apple and wheat country along the Columbia River on the way to Cooley, Washington. But it's here in the middle of August. The Melvilles are still thousands of miles away from home. And the pressure to keep moving is rising. On the morning of August 18th, Gaga confessed in her journal that, quote, last night, Carrie insisted that I visit no more with gentlemen because I found too many things to go see. Okay, here's another bear story. All right, outside of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, the Melvilles had stopped at the 4th of July Summit Camp, which Gaga described as a very nice spot with log cabins and 2 cute bear cubs that begged for eats. On the morning of the 19th, when they were packing up to leave, Gaga wrote, it was hard to pack up for watching the bears feed, growl, and tumble around. Martha went near one I'd just fed an apple, and the bear bit her in the right leg, between her knee and hip. So, being good parents, just to make sure that she was okay, when they got to Kellogg, Idaho, the Melvilles found a doctor to check Martha's leg, and the bite turned out to be nothing serious. Now, another quick sidebar here. A number of Gigi's negatives, the locations of which were unmarked, or their IDs had been lost over the century. Because I had Gaga's notes, carefully noting where they had went in the sequence, I went on Google Earth and went to Street View on each one of these little towns. And what did I come up with? building with the distinctive windows and the cornice here on this building is an exact match. And that, through the application of Google Earth, was able to find a location, identification on that image. Now, it's also interesting to note that this is from 2011. By 2019, that building was gone. They'd taken it down. Kind of amazing. Now, the next photo, Mullen, I tried to do the same thing, but I didn't have any luck. I didn't have any luck, particularly with the landscape. But on another bit of sleuthing, on the very, very far right-hand corner of that negative was a part of a sign, and it with the letters M-U-L-L, and that solved the issue. So it was definitely Mullen. Yes, definitely. So the next 4 days, the Melvilles drove through some beautiful southern Montana mountain country, and on August 23rd, they arrived at the entrance to Yellowstone, and set up camp at Madison Junction. This gives you a really good idea of what their tent-up situation looks like. The nights were cold. The wash basins were filled with ice crystals every morning. But the days warmed up as they explored the geysers and the hot springs throughout the valley. In the next few days, they made it to the summit of Mount Washburn, which is an amazing drive, apparently, especially in a Model T. They explored Tower Falls and Mammoth Hot Springs. Okay, here's the last bear story. While driving back to their camp in Yellowstone, Gaga wrote, this scares the hell out of me. On the way, we fed a cub bear. And a big bear started to get in the Ford with us. So she says, quote, so I said, here, take them. You can have them all. Take a full box of raisins. Okay. Begin to wonder about my grandparents sometimes. With the self-imposed time constraints coming into play, after all, we're talking about getting towards the end of August. The pace of travel picked up, and the number of photographs that Gigi took was reduced. By August 29, they were near Buffalo, Wyoming, where Gigi noted a new kind of cattle guard that he noted that it kind of looked like an oil changing rack. Oh, and I forgot to mention, when they were near Cody, they happened to see President Coolidge and his entourage out there in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming. And apparently Bob had a chance to get out and shake his hand as well. And they wondered, why was the president out here? Well, it turns out that he was out there to attend the beginning of the construction of Mount Rushmore. And that's the only reason he was out there. And she said that he gave, quote, he gave us a big wave and a smile. And I wonder if he saw the Worcester license plate on the car, because of course he was governor of Massachusetts, you know, at one point. Anyway, so after they let's see, by the cattle guard like an oil changing rack, and from there they made a straight shot to Devil's Tower. But they had to ford the Belforche River to get to the tower, and the water was up to the Worcester sign on the front bumper. It was pretty high. Once in South Dakota, the Melvilles went through the Black Hills and onto the Badlands, where navigation became an issue again because of the lack of road signs. That's an understatement, I think. But in the tiny town of Interior, South Dakota, Wonderland Art afforded an opportunity to purchase some Indian beads, some geodes, and some fossils from the artist Hans Thompson. Total 15,424 miles. Making a beeline across South Dakota, the Melvilles found themselves at the Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota tri-point, and in Larchwood they got weighed. This is interesting. Car and us, 2,700 pounds. Trailer, 1,260. So the total weight of them with the trailer was 3,960 pounds. The 1st of September found them going through Sioux City, Cedar Falls, and on into Independence, Iowa. Now in Beloit, where Gaga had some family, after doing a day of wash and listening to the radio, which was a huge treat for Gaga, and catching up with friends and family, Gaga noted that they were all dead tired. And she couldn't sleep, worrying about going on. She wanted to get the kids back to school. And she finally decided to go on with the trip. She wept over it, in spite of my wish not to. It's becoming obvious that they all needed to get home. So on September 6th, the Melvilles left Beloit to see more family in Gary, Indiana. Now, remarkably, having traveled over 16,000 miles, they had not had one collision with another vehicle. But that record came to an end. Unfortunately, in Joliet, Illinois, on September 6th, at mileage 16,425, according to Gaga, a car ran into hubbub, slightly injuring Gaga and Martha and damaging the left front fender. Fortunately, with some of Gaga's family living in Gary, they were able to stay with them for a few days while hubbub was repaired. The Melvilles left Gary on September 10th at 9:10 a.m., but their streak of bad luck continued. As just 35 minutes later, the right wheel of the trailer fell off. It would seem but both the passengers and the equipment are wearing out after 8 months on the road. But after a day-long delay, they were back on the road by 6 p.m. and actually logged 77 miles that day to a camp near South Bend. After swinging up into Ontario to view Niagara Falls, the final push was on through Oneida, Utica, and Saratoga Springs to a friend's house in Greenwich, New York, sorry. September 17th, the final day of the trip, included stops in North Adams and Greenfield, but thankfully were otherwise uneventful. Now, rather philosophically, Gaga wrote, quote, "We all feel serious to have the trip end. I hated to think of our own family group being shared with others. Just selfish, I know. But it doesn't often come to one to have one's family together. With no outsiders. Don't self again. Oh, testing. There we go. Okay. Doesn't often come to one to have one's family all together with no outsiders for such a long while." That's the last photo of the trip. And then she wrote, "Carrie and I got quite a thrill as we came down the Paxton Road and saw Worcester Lights. Moment 10. Now, one last thing before I close. Gigi was a mathematician. And true to form, at the end of the trip, he broke down every bit of automobile data from the whole 8 months into a 1927 equivalent of a spreadsheet. All done on a slide rule, of course. I'm sure he took great delight in calculating all this minutia. For example, miles per gallon, 20.7. Total cost of gas and oil, $248.10. Gas and oil cost per mile, 1.4 cents. Average gas cost, 24.5 cents. And even total auto expenses per mile, including repair and tires, 2.7 cents. A fitting end to an epic road trip. Thank you all.
Any questions?
Oh, they would love this. They would love it. Questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead. How many plaques cost?
What's that?
How many plaques?
That's one thing I did not count, but I should have, because there were times, especially for some reason in Texas, where they would have 3, 4, 5, 6 a day, and they'd have to patch the tubes and patch the tire, and they would order tires to be delivered to the next city they were going to. It was an amazing amount of maintenance that they had to do. It really was. But that's an interesting question. As a matter of fact, I'll go through the journals and get that figure. Yes.
What format did you shoot in the photographs?
It was they're 2 1/4, 3 1/4. Some of it was pack film, others was roll film. I don't know exactly what cameras he used, but that's the size of the negative.
Size for the negative.
Yes. Yes.
Did your mother ever talk about the trip?
That's an interesting question. Let me just change this here. That's a very interesting question. The answer is no. Which always surprised me and Susan, that there was never much discussion about the trip itself. You got to figure, she was 16. Who the hell wants to spend 8 months with your parents in the back seat of a car? Jeez, you know?
There's no appropriate radio.
Yeah. Exactly. So the answer was no. There was never much discussion about the trip. Yes?
Have you given any thought to publishing a book? I'm serious. This needs to be shared. This is American history.
Yeah.
I bought several copies.
I'm going to remember that. Thank you for saying that. But truth be told, I've had these negatives for probably 40 years. And it's only since that I've retired that I've been able to tackle many of these projects that have lain fallow. I initially cleaned the negatives and put them in archival storage and everything, but they've just been sitting there for, like I say, I hate to admit it, for decades. And it's only now that I've been able to take the time to go through, because there's a lot of research. My grandmother's writing is horrendous. And I have some of the journals up here. You're welcome to take a look at them. So that's the answer. I haven't considered that, but it's a great thought. Yes?
Why does this seem to be a little long? Is it because there aren't any direct roads? I mean, 2,400 miles to get to Florida, it's only about 15 years.
They did a lot of winding around, exploring, as my grandmother indicated, looking for out-of-the-way places. So I think that's the answer. Yes?
They do a lot of research to where they were going.
Repeat your question.
What?
Repeat your question.
Oh, okay, yeah. The question was, did they do a lot of research before they left? There's an interesting quote, I didn't get into it, but after my grandfather made the initial proposal to my grandmother, she wrote a very long statement in one of her journals about, okay, so Carrie has given us this, thrown this idea out. We have to decide whether to do it or not. And she said that I went down to the newsstand and I got every single book I could find on camping and travel and et cetera, et cetera. And then she also went and bought 100 postcards to send to companies to find out what they could get. So yes, they did do a ton of research. Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering what happened to Hubba.
I have no clue. I have no idea. I wish I had it. But no, I really don't. I never heard any discussion about what happened to Hubba. It was pretty worn out, I'm sure. But it did have a Roxdale axle. Anyone? Yes?
Was it a brand new car when they left?
I don't know that either. I don't have any information about the purchase of Hubbub at all. I know, you're right. You're absolutely, it would have been a big deal, yes. Anything else?
Just curious as to what maps they had, if any?
Huh. Minimal.
What was the question, Bob?
Oh, maps. What maps they had, the question was. They had some maps, and as a matter of fact, I've got a couple of the original maps they had, and they actually, especially in the Southwest, they actually had to draw in pencil the routes that they took because there were no roads indicated on the map. So they were minimal at best. Yes?
The Melville collection, is it on display, was it, or is it tucked away?
No, the question was, is the Melville collection on display at Wesleyan? No, it is not. It may, some of it may be in the future, in the near future, but right now, no.
Why is it there?
Why is it there? My grandmother, we had many discussions about what to do with the collection. She knew my interests in archaeology and anthropology. She wanted me to have it. I felt that it was more important that that collection should go to an institution where it could be researched and viewed by people who knew what it was, rather than being hidden in a collection somewhere.
Bob, where did you go to school?
Well, I went to school at Clark and also transferred to Wesleyan in my senior year, I guess it was. And the truth is, Wesleyan was, despite the connection with Clark, I mean, my grandfather had taught there for 20-something years, and there was a close association with Clark. And I suggested perhaps that you go to Clark. Gaga was so impressed with what Wesleyan did for me and my wife Susan when we first went there. This was during the Vietnam War era. That she wanted it to go to Wesleyan because of how they treated me. And that's how it's at Wesleyan. Yes?
I noticed on the radiator was a AAA
Yes.
sticker.
Yes.
Had insurance on the
AAA, absolutely. AAA's been in existence since there were cars. So yes. Anybody else?
What was the average speed when they were short?
What was the?
Average speed?
Oh, I don't think, even with a Roxdale axle, I don't think they could get more than what, 45?
On a good road.
On a good road, right, yeah. Okay. Yes?
We did a Route 66 trip on the anniversary of Route 66, which was finished in 1926. They didn't really have a whole lot of number of highways and routes. In 1927, so I can understand how they would get so, it would take them so long and the roads were so winding.
Yeah, there was minimal signage along many areas of the country. And actually only, I think about 30% of the roads were paved over the whole country. Anything else? Yes.
Do you have any idea how they manage money going across country?
Yes, I do, as a matter of fact. And that's why I put up that one sign that Gaga said, we won't cash your checks, but, they had to carry a letter of credit and hope that the banks that they went to would honor it. And in a couple of places in, I think it was Louisiana, they would not honor it unless they actually made a phone call, which means they had to find a telephone to call Worcester to get the authorization to accept their letter of credit. No credit cards. No. Anything else? Yes.
You said given before the trip is from the Goddards, and that we go to Robert Goddard family.
He actually worked with Goddard. When Goddard was just beginning to do his rocket research at Clark, and when Goddard had to go down to New Mexico, my grandfather actually took over his classes while he was down there. And so yeah, they were very close actually. They really were. Anything else? I'm a photographer. Yes. We live here in town with my wife Susan and our dog Jessie and our cat and thousands and thousands of negatives. Great, thank you all. Thank you very much.
I just want to point out, everybody notice, see that sack hanging off the side of the car? That's a water sack, right?
Yeah.
They carry, that's how they had to carry the water. Thank you all for coming. You can come up and speak to Bob. He's got a few things in the showcase from that trip. Remember, February 27th, Covered Bridges of Massachusetts will be in the program. Thank you for coming again.
I'm sorry, you've been waiting.
That's a radiator cap? Yeah, I wonder if it is. Yeah. It is. Look it's in the photo.
How was that?
Oh, it is. Well, that survived anyway. Yeah.
Into what looked like 100-foot. The point of it is, you can imagine, you can't plan on anything unless it's wild.
Exactly, and both my wife and I discovered that this summer when we were down doing a presentation to the Hopi Nation, is that driving in the same area, there's nothing there now. Never mind 100 years ago.
It's crazy. The wagon train days. You finally get over this mountain, and as soon as you get over it, you're looking outside, there's still 1,000 miles of nothing.
Crazy stuff, right?
Yeah.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh, absolutely. It's great. Thank you very
Tickled to death. Some areas I might be grandmother's house, my grandmother's house, and I would walk to the attic. That I